genel izleyici kitlesi için uygundur.
Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Farklı bölgelerden, farklı ülkelerden konuklarla bölgesel ve küresel meselelere dair her hafta farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye çalışıyoruz. Dünyayı Ekotürk'te buluşturuyoruz. Aslında İstanbul'a da gelen, dünyanın dört bir yanından gelen birbirinden kıymetli akademisyenleri, uzmanları da bir yandan ağırlıyoruz burada. Bugün de stüdyomuzda, bahçe stüdyomuzda çok kıymetli bir konuğumuz var ABD'den. Doktorasını Harvard'dan alan, halihazırda Northwestern Üniversitesi'nde Siyaset Bilimi ve Uluslararası İlişkiler bölümünde öğretim üyeliğine devam eden, özellikle Orta Doğu üzerine çalışan, Filistin, Suriye özelinde pek çok kitabı da bulunan, hatta kitaplarından bir tanesi Türkçe'ye de çevrilmişti. Suriyelilerin hikayesini merkeze alan, geçtiğimiz 13 yıllık savaş sürecinde Suriyelilerin hikayesini merkezine alan Bir Köprüden Geçtik isimli We Crossed A Bridge isimli İngilizce kitabının Türkçe'ye de çevirisi yapılmıştı. Çok sayıda kitabı var. Biraz bugün Profesör Wendy Pearlman'la Orta Doğu'yu konuşacağız. Suriye'deki bilhassa 8 Aralık 2024 tarihinde yaşanan değişimi, o değişimin öncesini ve sonrasını konuşacağız. Professor Wendy Pearlman, welcome to Istanbul, welcome to my show. Thank you very much for joining us. Hoş geldiniz.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Professor Wendy Pearlman, you have a lot of books. Just I showed one of them was also translated into Turkish. I hope and wish the others were also translated, but hopefully maybe in the future the others, especially the last one,
Yes.
The Home, I worked to make based on Syrian voices actually from the Syrian diaspora this time. So I would like to talk about, of course, Syria today with you. You're an expert on Syria. You have done a great job documenting Syrian people's voices actually over the course of the war and this crisis. Before and after December 8th, 2024, of course, we will talk, Professor. Till now, and maybe still, by the way, everyone talked about Syrians throughout the war, but very few actually talked to them, and you are one of the few, also one of them. And perhaps that's why Syria's revolution and war have been badly misunderstood, especially in the West, but also in Turkey. I want to start with the question of why did we, I will say, but you can take it as why did the West misunderstand about Syria until December 8th, 2024, and even afterwards till to this date maybe. Let's start with this, and also after that I will ask your opinions, of course, on the day of December 8th and later on.
Yeah, I think the biggest misunderstanding about Syria is people's failure to appreciate that what began in 2011 was a popular uprising of ordinary people calling for freedom, calling for dignity, wanting to liberate themselves from a very brutal authoritarian regime. Hafez al-Assad seized power in 1970. His son Bashar al-Assad inherited the presidency upon his father's death. This was a regime based on fear, on surveillance, on corruption, on violence, on threat of violence. It denied Syrians the opportunity to speak, to live, to imagine the future. And after decades and decades, Syrians rose up and said, enough, we want to live as full human beings. And I think that many in the West have failed to understand that this was a political struggle of people wanting to be free. Often Syria has been looked at only as a humanitarian crisis. Syrian refugees fled the country, they need food, they need shelter, not looking at the reasons why people fled, and not looking at the fact that that's rooted in a political struggle. These aren't just people who need food and water. They want political rights and political change, which is what they finally want. So sometimes Syria is looked only at as a humanitarian struggle or crisis. On the other hand, some misunderstand the politics. They think that the Syrian opposition was this elite group that maybe were puppets of the West, puppets of Saudi Arabia, that maybe had extreme Islamist ideological agendas or had some other kind of political strategy. That completely misunderstands the nature of the Syrian revolution, which was ordinary people who wanted to breathe, who wanted to live, who mustered the courage to risk their lives to go out and protest. And hundreds of thousands of Syrians lost their lives. They were imprisoned in brutal imprisonment and tortured to death. They were killed, they were starved, they were bombed. And of course, as the Syrian war evolved, and it became a war because the regime itself responded with cruel, violent repression against these peaceful protests, but it began as peaceful protests. As the regime responded with violence, a war began in which different groups emerged, and other states became involved with their own agendas, and non-state actors became involved with their own agendas. But the core of this crisis and the core of the struggle has always been ordinary people. And that's what we have to understand. And when you speak to Syrians, that's exactly what they will tell you.
And also your recent book, and also your previous book, We Crossed the Bridge, you exactly make this effort to understand them, to talk to them, to talk to ordinary Syrians. That's exactly what you have been doing. So, Professor, the fall of the regime, Assad regime, lasted 13 years in the past, but of course there's a long history of Assad rule, both father and son. In just 13 days, as seen from outside, marked, of course, major transformation last year, December 8th. What were the key factors that made this collapse possible, especially domestic factors?
Yes.
Because as you also pointed out, the major focus is usually on the foreign actors, foreign involvements. And also, what does the downfall of the Assad regime mean for ordinary Syrians, of course?
Yeah, thank you for focusing on the domestic aspect, because too often in conversations with Syria, people deny Syrians agency. They think that all the important decisions are made from the outside, as if Syrians have the power to act as individuals and affect their own fate. So as we know, the uprising began in 2011. It was met with brutal repression. It evolved into this brutal war that by 2020, many were calling a frozen conflict or forgotten conflict, because the Assad regime had largely reconsolidated political and territorial control. And there I would really blame many actors in the international community that did not stand up to Assad, that of course controlled the skies, bombed from the air, and there was a limit to what any people can do on the ground to defend themselves when they're facing barrel bombs and chemical weapons. So Assad had increasingly consolidated control, and many states were beginning to normalize relations with Assad, to welcome this brutal dictator back into the fold as if nothing had happened, as if he had not committed crimes against humanity, against his own people. But as that was evolving, there were several factors on the ground that were slowly building up. And I would point to two. One is the opposition was slowly getting stronger. Opposition groups, armed opposition groups, and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham being the largest and most powerful of them, were confined in Idlib province, and they were slowly training, organizing themselves, planning and strategizing, increasing their capacity and their planning to have a more unified offensive, to have these groups work together and be effective and carry out an effective attack on the regime. So they were getting stronger. At the same time, the Assad regime itself was getting weaker. By 2024, it was a hollow-out shell. The economy was abysmal. The regime was essentially a narco-state that used exporting Captagon to enrich itself. It benefited a very small circle of very corrupt individuals, and the huge majority of Syrians did not benefit at all. More than 90% of the population is under the poverty line. There's not electricity, there's not food, there's not warmth. So when the rebels attacked the Assad regime, the regime largely fell apart. Its soldiers, who once might have fought or died for this regime, said to themselves, what does this regime give us? We as soldiers don't even have salaries. We don't have enough to eat. Will we fight for this regime? They took off their uniforms and largely went home. And the regime just crumbled because more and more the Syrian population realized that this regime benefited absolutely no one but itself.
Mm-hmm. What about now? Let's come to post-Assad era. Now the Assad era is over, and of course there are some legitimate, let's say, concerns for the future of Syria now under this, by Western terms, I will say, so-called Islamist rule under Hayat Tahrir Sham, HTS. So there are some also concerns regarding minorities, their rights, etc. So under this rule, what till now, by the way, since December 8th, till now, how do you evaluate Ahmed Shara's performance in terms of inclusiveness, democratic transformation of the regime? What are your concerns? And also, I would like to ask you about the quick embrace of the West of Ahmed Shara, which was seen as a very radical jihadist in the past. But after December 8th, we have seen many Western ministers and also some politicians rushed to Damascus and met him in person. So tell us more about his performance and also explain us this Western approach to him, basically.
Yeah. So to begin with the second question, the rush of the Western approach, I think it's the recognition that this is the reality, that if people in the West are concerned about Syria's security, Syria's stability, about Syria not being a source of refugee outflow, they have to discuss and have dialogue with the new authorities. That's the reality on the ground. At the same time, it's very frustrating because over many, many years of this brutal war, people in the West said, oh, maybe Assad is the least evil. If
the devil we know.
The devil we know is better than the devil we don't know. The alternative is radical Islamist rule that will violate all sorts of rights. That if Assad falls, there'll be chaos and bloodshed. And clearly Assad got on a plane and fled, and there was no bloodshed, hardly any violence. And it really breaks your heart to think this could have and should have happened much, much earlier and saved so many lives and so much destruction. Assad should have fallen in 2011, and I think there needs to be a lot of soul searching in the West about why they had such little faith in the Syrian people to be peaceful, to want the best for their own country, to want prosperity, democracy, and stability. So that's, I think, the soul searching that the West needs to do. As far as the current interim authorities, and I really see it as interim authorities, that this is a political transition. HTS led the offensive, so they're the new authorities in Damascus, but there will be a political transition to a new sort of government, and I hope that government is participatory, is inclusive, is not HTS rule, is a rule in which Syrians finally have the capacity and the right to choose their own governments. So I've been pretty pleased in many ways with Shara's performance so far. But I think these concerns about democracy and inclusiveness are legitimate. And I think they're chiefly legitimate because Syrians themselves are continually voicing these concerns.
Right.
So those of us outside don't have to worry and voice our concerns on Syrians' behalf. We can follow what Syrians are saying as they articulate their own priorities. And even with inclusiveness, I think the concern is not only religious minorities. Many members of the Sunni Arab Muslim majority also want to be more included because they want people of different ideologies and political positions to not have a government that's just one group or one ideology. They need to broaden the base and let people from civil society, experts with different points of view participate. And one thing that I've heard again and again from Syrians over these past months is how eager they are to contribute. Syrians of all walks of life, of every imaginable sector. Architects want to participate in reconstructing.
Right.
Economists want to participate in designing new economic policy. There's been so much capacity developed in civil society organizations and initiatives. People want to participate. They want to offer their expertise. They want to help their country recover, and the government needs to broaden its base. So while there have been many good statements and declarations and moves over the past months, I think some Syrians are frustrated that there is not more, a little frustrated that maybe there's not a clearer timeline. When precisely will this interim government end? At first there were declarations of March 1st.
Right.
We're not sure if that will happen. What is the timeline for writing a new constitution? What's the process of figuring out who will write the constitution? When will there be new elections? What's the process of designing an electoral system?
There are lots of questions, but still, I guess, Professor, please confirm me if I'm wrong, but they don't have fear at least. They have concerns, but they don't fear. Because with normalization with Assad, normalization process with Assad was probably never gonna get Syrians back to Syria. But now after Assad is gone, maybe some of them are going to stay in the host countries, but most of them maybe are willing to go. And they don't fear to go anymore because there is no Assad. What do you think?
Without a doubt, 100%. I think if you talk to nearly any Syrian, they'll say, the worst is behind us. There is nothing worse than the Assad regime. Now there's hope. Now there's possibility. Of course, the road ahead is going to be complicated. It's filled with challenges, as it is for any country that has undergone a transition. Any country that has moved from authoritarianism to democracy faces these challenges. Any country that has moved from war to peace faces these challenges. So none of these are unique to the Syrian situation. Everything I was saying about constitutions and elections, as a political scientist, I can say this is in every single country. And now it's Syrians' time. So there are concerns because the challenges are so big. And the biggest challenge is actually economic recovery. The economy is in absolute ruins. There's not electricity, there's not water, there's not fuel, there's not jobs, there's high inflation.
And the sanctions are still in place.
And that is chiefly because the sanctions are still in place. So countries that have sanctions against Syria must lift those sanctions so Syria can begin to recover. The economic recovery is linked to political stability and peace, and stability is linked to the process of political change. So the challenges are big, as they would be in any country, but thank you for emphasizing that Syrians have hope more than fear, and that hope is incredible. Syrians struggled for 14 years to win their freedom, and against all the odds, they won. Now they have a chance. And I hope that countries act in solidarity with Syrians and give them the help that they need to recover from over 50 years of dictatorship that ruined the country and left the country in that ruined state.
But, I want to go deeper into this refugee issue, Professor. As you know, Syria became stuck in many minds all around the world to the words refugee crisis. And ironically now, Assad himself is a refugee in Moscow, by the way. And I was really touched by the words of a Syrian after December 8th. I am no longer a Syrian refugee anymore. I'm no longer a Syrian refugee. I am just a Syrian. So a lot of refugees they don't have to be refugee anymore. So most of them are going to go back. But I want to ask you the performance of countries handling this refugee crisis, especially Turkey as the country which hosts more than any other countries in terms of Syrian refugees. So how did the host countries handle this refugee crisis, do you think? And what are if you compare countries' performances, what would you say, depending on your interviews with Syrians in diaspora all around the world?
Yeah, so over the course of this war, something like 14 million Syrians, more than half of the population were forced to flee their homes. And some 7 million of those are internally displaced people, and some 7 million are refugees all over the world. And countries varied. I mean, Turkey, of course, was exceptional in its generosity of allowing at one point some 3.5 million Syrian refugees into the country. Germany in Europe also was quite generous in allowing Syrians to apply for asylum. But there have, of course, also been a lot of struggles. And I think Syrian refugees' conditions have really varied, especially about their legal status. That even temporary protection, while offering people the ability to find a safe haven can be really difficult for refugees in terms of planning their future. I wrote the second book on the idea of home,
Right.
and one of the things I really saw again and again was Syrians wanting to build a sense of belonging, have stability in their lives, plan for their futures, provide for their children's futures. And when they're in a place and they don't know if they can stay, they don't know if they might be deported, they're afraid they might get kicked out, it creates a huge existential sense of fear or dread, always thinking, do I have to go somewhere next? What will happen to me? If something changes in this country where I live and I get kicked out, where will I go? That's an enormous fear that I would hope everyone who is not a refugee can try to put themselves in those shoes and imagine, how do you build a life when you don't know where you can live and where you can stay? And I think that's one of the importance of December 8th, is that many Syrians now feel like, if I need to, I can go back to Syria. At the same time, I think Syrians absolutely need time to figure out if it's the right move for them and their families to go back to Syria. Because as we said, Syria is still economically a wreck. If they go back to Syria, maybe their home no longer exists. It might be rubble. Maybe their entire town no longer exists. Right. Will there be work? Will there be electricity? Will their kids be able to go to school? So for many, I think Syrians all over the world have hope. They want to contribute to their country. They want the best for their country. But maybe they want to return, maybe not. Maybe they have spent years building a life in a new place.
And there are hundreds of thousands, by the way, born here in these countries,
Absolutely.
in Turkey, in other host countries. So speaking of home, home is very kind of interesting word to describe, I guess, because where do they feel as home, for instance? The ones that are born here, but families are willing to go back to Syria. So it's a kind of tricky word also.
Yes, that's exactly why I wrote a book on it, because it's such a complicated word and because home can mean so many different things. And there are people I talk to that absolutely feel a sense of home in the new country where they live because they worked so hard to learn the language, to go to school, to recreate their lives, because time has passed. Some people have, children especially, maybe spent more time in the host country or all their life.
They don't speak Arabic anymore. They just speak Turkish, for instance.
So I think in that context, it's very early and premature to talk about Syrian refugees needing to return. And it's also inhumane to expect that that is the best choice. Before anyone talks about returning Syrians to Syria, they need to look at what Syria is and think, is that really livable? Think about what is needed for Syria to get on its feet. And also respect that it's a very individual choice. Some Syrians want to return, some already have returned, some do not want to return. Maybe some want to live their lives in two spaces and commute and go back and forth and have part of their life in Syria where they can be a part of Syria, but also have their lives or their businesses or their children or their families somewhere else where they've created a new life. And I hope that host states have a sense of flexibility and a sense of humanity, listen to Syrians and what they need, and give Syrians the time they need. It's in everyone's interest, both Syrians' interests and states' interests, to allow Syrians to go back and explore without losing their temporary protection status.
Professor, we have only a few minutes left, and I also want to ask your take on Israel's actions within Syria as well, and also, of course, the ongoing slaughter in Gaza as well, of course, and also violence in the West Bank, etc. But also Israel's actions within Syria is also a cause of concern for many, and also many people view Assad as if he was anti-Israel, and now with this current government's relations with Israel will... What do you think? How is your take on this issue, Israel's actions within Syria?
Yeah, so to begin with this, another misunderstanding about the Assad regime that actively used a propaganda claiming that it was part of the axis of resistance and standing up to Israel, which was completely false. The Assad regime preserved the border with Israel, didn't stand up to Israel in any way, and killed Palestinians within its own population. So that was just propaganda to try to legitimate itself and delegitimize the opposition. And I hope no one would fall for that trick. If you have any doubts, you can look at the pictures of the Yarmouk Palestinian refugee camp outside Damascus and see how Assad treated Palestinians. For Israel itself, it's just mind-boggling how brazen and unacceptable and cruel and illogical Israel's actions are. After destroying Gaza, starving Gaza, bombing Gaza to bits, it then also bombs and destroys so much of Lebanon, and now Israel, now Syria, without any provocation whatsoever. Israel is violating Syria's national sovereignty. It is destroying its military capacity. It is now occupying territory in what seems to be a land grab of wanting to annex Syrians' territory. Are there no limits to what Israel will do and how it uses this type of aggression against its neighbors? I would hope that the international community and my own country, the United States, could stand up to Israel and say, these are basic norms of the international community to not commit crimes against humanity and atrocities, and to respect the national sovereignty and national will of your neighbors, and to have basic rights for human life.
Under Trump, it seems even
less likely. It's
impossible for Professor, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, and in the Syrian context, it's especially disturbing because Syria is in such a fragile, delicate moment. After decades of struggling for freedom, Syrians finally had the chance to focus internally and build the country they want. And at the same time, Israel is bombing this country and provoking this country and stealing land. It is beyond imagination that Israel would take advantage of this moment. It must end. It must end.
Thank you very much, Professor. I would love to talk to you more and more, but unfortunately time is up. Maybe next time when you visit Istanbul. Thanks so much for your time and for your valuable contributions to our lives with these books. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Evet, Saat Farkı'nda bu hafta ABD'den Northwestern Üniversitesi'nden siyaset bilimci Profesör Wendy Pearlman'ı ağırladık. Özellikle Suriye üzerine yayınladığı kitaplar ışığında, son kitabı bilhassa ışığında Suriye'deki değişimi konuştuk. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla karşınızda olmak dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.